On May 10, 2003, something unusual happened. Joey Fulgham, who had never missed an air show, failed to appear at one. Moreover, the next day, on Mother's Day, he also ignored this important holiday, although he usually always greeted his loved ones and spent time with them. These two instances alarmed his family, so Joey's mother and sister decided to visit him at home. What they saw shocked them to the core. Joey was lying face down on the bed. There was a huge wound in the back of his head, and it appeared that the man had been shot from behind. Without wasting a minute, the women called 911 to report the horrifying discovery. Soon, law enforcement officers arrived at the scene and began examining the crime scene. First, the police questioned the victim's mother and sister, who had discovered the body. Despite being highly distraught, the women answered the questions quite clearly. They suggested that only Joey's wife, Christie, with whom he had a tense relationship, could have killed him. The relatives said that Christie openly cheated on her husband and did not hide her desire to get rid of the tiresome married life. Thus, the investigators had a prime suspect, but she was not at home. After a brief search, the police found Christie at her mother's house in the small neighboring town of Little Rock. During questioning, the woman acted as if she knew nothing about the tragedy. When law enforcement informed her about her husband's death, she burst into tears and began to wail. Christie's actions did not seem suspicious, so the detectives continued collecting evidence. It was only later that substantial evidence emerged against Christie, but before she could be arrested, she voluntarily came to the police station in Starkville. Moreover, she was not alone but with her stepbrother on her father's side. In the sheriff's office, 27-year-old Christie told her version of events. According to her, on the morning when Joey was killed, her 13-year-old stepbrother Tyler was visiting the couple's house. A serious conflict broke out between the husband and wife, during which Joey hit Christie. Seeing this, Tyler became furious and rushed to defend his sister. Of course, the teenager could not match the strength of an adult man, so he decided to act differently. The boy grabbed a rifle and shot the sleeping Joey in the back of the head. Meanwhile, the investigators began interrogating Tyler. They started talking to him without the presence of adults or a lawyer, which, of course, was a violation that later played a role in this case. The boy's mother was informed about the incident and immediately arrived at the police station in the neighboring town. Initially, Tyler denied his involvement in the murder, but then, when Christie entered the room and gave him some kind of sign, his testimony changed dramatically. The teenager repeated his sister's version, adding a few new details. He confessed that early in the morning, he and Christie sneaked into the bedroom and shot the man with a rifle. Upon hearing this confession, Tyler's mother nearly fainted from shock. She fell to her knees and wept bitterly. It was evident that a 13-year-old boy was unlikely to be able to handle a weapon on his own. Tyler himself admitted that he would not have been able to pull the trigger by himself, so he needed his sister's help. Thus, the investigation obtained a confession according to which the teenager was the initiator of the crime, and his sister was an accomplice. Tyler said that a few weeks before the incident, Christie had asked him for an old family .22 caliber rifle, which he handed over to her. The sister allegedly feared a large dog that constantly ran into the couple's yard and wanted to be able to protect herself and the children. The boy, of course, did not want Christie or her children to get hurt, so he gave her the weapon without hesitation. And this was despite the fact that Tyler himself loved animals very much and even fed stray dogs. He begged his sister not to kill the dog. Eventually, Christie assured her brother that she would only shoot into the air to scare off the pesky animal if necessary. Moreover, Tyler was convinced that the rifle was unlikely to work. After all, it was a very old weapon that had been gathering dust in the attic for many years. For over a year, the boy and his friends had been trying to repair it so that they could later engage in sport shooting, but to no avail. The old relic could not be restored. So, the teenager decided that the weapon posed no threat. On the eve of the tragic event, on Friday, it was Christie who was supposed to pick Tyler up from school. But she was too busy with her new lover, Kyle, and became so engrossed with him that she completely forgot about the time. The woman arrived at the school a few hours late, picked up her brother, and took him to her home. Upon returning, they went out to the backyard together to test the rifle. And the boy's assumption was confirmed, the weapon did not work. Then Christie hid it in the trunk of her car. Tyler was sure that it was still lying there. However, there were some inaccuracies and discrepancies with his sister's testimony in the teenager's story. He was confused about their positions during the shot and how exactly they held the rifle. Despite his confession, the description of the murder seemed somewhat far-fetched and illogical. Some facts simply did not match the boy's words. A few days after the interrogation, Tyler again turned to the detectives and recanted his previous testimony. The teenager admitted that he had taken the blame to protect his stepsister. He said he thought that because of his young age, he would not be put behind bars, so he readily took responsibility. But now the young man was facing life imprisonment. So, he decided to tell a new version of events. According to Tyler, on May 10, 2003, he and his older stepsister Christie were planning a trip to visit the boy's father. The night before, the teenager stayed over at his sister's place. That Saturday morning, Tyler woke up early to the sound of Christie's alarm to get ready for the trip. He got into his sister's car, and she asked him to wait with her daughter. They sat in the car for about 5 minutes, and just as Tyler was tuning the radio, a loud bang came from the house. The boy was sure that the rifle was in the trunk, so he paid no attention to this sound. Moreover, Christie had a cat that often knocked things over and broke them. Tyler thought that this was exactly the case. Especially since a few minutes later, his sister, as if nothing had happened, came out of the house, got into the car, and they drove off calmly. It was only on the way back that Christie confessed to having shot Joey with a rifle. The shocked Tyler did not know what to think. And his sister, crying, begged him to protect her from the death penalty. So, the boy promised to take some of the blame, not realizing at his young age what punishment awaited him. Could Tyler really be the one who killed his sister's husband? To answer this question, law enforcement had to study the life of this family in detail. Christie and Tyler Edmonds went to the same school, although the girl was much older and graduated earlier. As a student, Tyler was always a smart and diligent boy. Quiet, kind, and sweet. Moreover, he easily found common ground with his peers and other people thanks to his sociability. It seemed that he had a bright future ahead of him, as pure as his heart. Tyler's mother, Sharon, raised her son on her own. His parents divorced when the boy was very young due to his father's aggressive behavior. The child lost the opportunity to see his dad, as the man had been humiliating and tyrannizing his wife for a long time. Eventually, Sharon's patience ran out, and she could no longer put up with such treatment. The woman filed for divorce and obtained sole custody of her son. To protect Tyler, she completely stopped his communication with his biological father, even under the supervision of social services. But the boy's stepsister on his father's side, Christie Fulgham, knew that he wanted to see his dad. Despite his mother's prohibition and the court's decision, the child still felt attached to his father and wanted to meet with him at least occasionally, communicate, and spend time together. So, Christie decided to help her stepbrother see his father without Sharon's knowledge. Once, she asked Tyler if he wanted to spend the weekend at the house where his dad lived. At that time, his sister was the boy's only connection to his father's family. And Christie herself was a very important person in Tyler's life, he valued and respected her. The 13-year-old teenager gladly agreed, as he was really looking forward to meeting his father. At that time, 27-year-old Christie was already married to Joey, and they lived together with her 3 children in their own house. When her husband first met Christie, he was enchanted by her. She seemed to him the epitome of beauty and moral principles, such a bright personality that Joey deliberately did not notice any of her flaws, which, of course, she also had. Christie was indeed a pleasant woman, beautiful on the outside and charming, able to use her natural attractiveness. But later, this very thing became the cause of quarrels. The fact was that the wife turned out to be frivolous, selfish, and cared only about herself, not at all considering her husband's feelings. Christie did not even hide her affairs too much, and Joey knew about them but turned a blind eye to everything. The thing is that the woman most likely got married only to avoid upsetting her parents and to be like everyone else. And under this cover, she had affairs with various men. Joey sincerely loved Christie, but she was not at all interested in his feelings. Perhaps for her, he was just a smokescreen. The strangest secret in this woman's life turned out to be the fact that everyone around her loved her, her stepbrother, husband, father, and numerous lovers. But she herself, it seems, loved no one. Christie simply used people without any remorse. She was helped in this by her ability to masterfully manipulate men. As it turned out later, her loved ones suffered the most from this trait of hers. Christie had a great influence on her teenage stepbrother. Relatives repeatedly noted that both had the same biological father. From an early age, she became very close to Tyler, which played a cruel joke on him. Of course, the boy had no idea about Christie's insidious intentions. His sister used his desire to see his father as a way to gain additional control over his mind and heart. She constantly asked Tyler to lie to her husband and other boys so as not to get caught during her affairs. Christie also exploited Tyler to look after her children and even clean the house. At some point, she even tried to convince her brother that she would be a better guardian for him than his own mother. But the teenager did not give in to these provocations. He could not betray his mother. In fact, long before the events described, Sharon suspected that Christie had mental issues. The girl's behavior resembled that of a manipulator. She increasingly showed anger and aggression, lashing out at loved ones over trifles. All this was spontaneous and difficult to control. Of course, her family attributed this to stress or other common reasons for a long time. Unfortunately, the reality turned out to be much worse. The young woman was becoming increasingly embittered, and she blamed her loving husband Joey for all her problems. However, Sharon did not forbid Tyler to communicate with Christie. They were very close, and it seemed that despite the oddities in her sister's behavior, she still posed no threat. Both participants in the brutal massacre were arrested and charged with murder, a crime that, under the laws of the state of Mississippi, was punishable by execution. By the decision of the judges and given the severity of the crime, the teenager was tried as an adult. But because of his minor status, the boy could not be sentenced to death. So, it was expected that Tyler would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while Christie faced a lethal injection. On July 20, 2004, the trial in the case of Tyler Edmonds began. It was a high-profile, resonant case, as the main figure in the brutal murder was a 13-year-old schoolboy. The teenager was defended by one of the best lawyers in the state. He was convinced that his client's first confession was a lie, nothing more than the result of manipulation by his older sister. The defense also believed that the testimony was obtained under pressure from the police. During the interrogation, the child was very frightened. Moreover, Tyler was initially interrogated without the presence of his mother and a lawyer, which was a gross violation. The only physical evidence in the case, apart from the bullet, was Christie's fingerprints on the porch and the signal from the motion sensors of the lighting. The lights were turned off during the crime, probably so as not to attract the attention of neighbors. Only Christie's traces were found outside. The teenager insisted that he made a false confession only to save his stepsister from the death penalty, and he thought that because of his age, he would get away with it. But when Tyler realized that he could get a real sentence, he got scared and refused to help Christie. However, by the judge's decision, during the process, only the boy's confession was read to the jury by the prosecution. But not his refusal of previous testimony. In addition, an expert appeared on the prosecution side, who claimed that by the nature of the wounds received, he was able to accurately establish that two people were indeed holding the rifle. However, the specialist could not convincingly explain how he came to this conclusion. Despite the absurdity of the statement, the expert's words played an important role during the hearings. The jury was shown a video recording of the young man's confession, and the testimony of a respected specialist with extensive experience in forensic medical examinations was announced. No other arguments were presented. Before making a decision, the jury deliberated for about 5 hours. The defense was confident that the young man would be acquitted due to the weak evidence base. However, on July 24, 2004, the 15-year-old schoolboy was found guilty of the murder of Joey Fulgham. The boy was sentenced to life imprisonment. After the announcement of the verdict, the lawyer immediately filed an appeal. In fact, he never stopped fighting for justice and tried to get Tyler's case reviewed. Indeed, a large number of mistakes were found in the work of the investigators, and the prosecutor's office relied only on indirect evidence. The main evidence was the confession of the young man himself, but his defense was sure that the confession was obtained under pressure or with the help of psychological techniques that the interrogating officers possess. Since it was a minor, in fact a schoolboy, the officers had many levers of influence on the child who was left alone with them. And despite all the efforts of the lawyer, the young man ended up in prison. Very strict laws were in force in Mississippi, so it was extremely difficult to obtain an appeal for an already convicted criminal. But the lawyer did not lose hope, just like the people close to Tyler who knew him well. Most refused to believe that the young man could commit such a cold-blooded murder. He had good relations with all family members, including Joey. He did not suffer from mental illness or any disorders. The boy had virtually no motive for murder, and Christie's story sounded far-fetched. Many were convinced that the schoolboy's conviction was the result of a miscarriage of justice, and his confession was the result of manipulation by his stepsister. And the teenager's lawyer was determined. The defender understood that it was possible to achieve a review of the case only by giving it maximum publicity. Unfortunately, even in this case, the review would take years, as the trial of Tyler became the subject of public debate. There was so much noise around the trial that even legislators who wanted to revise the current norms of criminal law got involved. Finally, in January 2007, a glimmer of hope appeared. The Supreme Court of the state of Mississippi agreed to review Tyler's case. The defender managed to draw the attention of the judicial system. At this point, the teenager had already spent almost 4 years behind bars. The main problem was the testimony of that expert who convinced everyone that he had determined by the trajectory of the bullet how many people were holding the rifle. In fact, he could not draw such a conclusion only from the trajectory of the bullet at the moment of the shot. The testimony of this specialist was refuted by other experts and recognized as biased. After that, the Mississippi prosecutor's office found itself in a difficult situation, as they had no other evidence. The prosecution offered Tyler a plea deal. This could significantly simplify the situation and mitigate the sentence. The young man could plead guilty to a less serious crime and receive a corresponding term. It was even considered that the boy could be released from prison immediately, as he had already served a sufficient term. However, in this case, Tyler wanted not freedom, but to prove his innocence as a matter of principle. Of course, there was a small risk that the young man would be found guilty again and life imprisonment would be confirmed. Despite this probability, the young man rejected the prosecutor's offer. He claimed that he was innocent, so he was not going to take responsibility for someone else's crime. On October 28, 2008, a retrial of Tyler's case began. His lawyer perceived this case as a personal struggle. During his opening statement, the defender focused on the fact that the accusation was made against a 13-year-old boy as an adult criminal. Many mistakes were made during the investigation. The police did not observe the child's rights during the interrogation. Moreover, immediately after the confession, law enforcement officers focused on proving the schoolboy's guilt. But they did not even try to verify his words. At the same time, there were significant discrepancies between the confession and the evidence. The investigators noticed these inconsistencies. The authorities had only indirect evidence at their disposal, some of which even contradicted the young man's words. To confirm his position, the lawyer called Christie Fulgham as a witness. In his opinion, this was the best way to refute the bias. The defender believed that Tyler's sister would tell the truth, but this plan didn't work out. On the advice of her lawyer, Christie refused to answer any questions. Despite the fact that expectations were not met, Christie's behavior allowed the jury to see who she really was. And that the woman was hiding something. From the very beginning, her goals were self-serving. She didn't care at all about the fate of her stepbrother, whom she sought to frame, despite his devotion and young age. Unlike Tyler, Christie had a strong motive for murder. Joey had insured his life for $300,000, which could well become an additional reason for getting rid of the bothersome husband. Witnesses were found among the couple's acquaintances who confirmed the widow's mercenary intent. Shortly before the murder, she tried to find out how much money she would receive in the event of Joey's death. However, this could not be done, as her husband had filed a statement about the confidentiality of information. However, Christie was still confident that it would be a profitable deal and that she was the beneficiary of the payment. Christie's father testified in court, recounting how his daughter had asked him to give her a weapon and help kill her husband. And as a reward, she offered to buy her father a brand new Cadillac with the insurance money. But the man categorically refused to participate in the crime and advised his daughter to divorce Joey if he did not suit her. In despair, Christie replied that she would not receive the insurance then and would have to divide the property. Obviously, this was not profitable for her. Another reason for getting rid of her husband was that he found out about the birth of a younger child from his best friend. And he intended to file for divorce. Tyler's lawyer was convinced that Christie was planning to kill Joey anyway, but she took advantage of her brother's presence to shift the responsibility onto him. It is known that Christie had a manipulative character, so she simply deceived the schoolboy, forcing him to make a false confession by using her influence on him. At the time of the murder, Tyler Edmonds was 13 years old and was an excellent student at school. The boy had never shown aggression. He was not noticed for antisocial behavior. He was not interested in criminal activity. Tyler was never accused of antisocial acts. The teenager was a true role model, respectful of his elders, and regularly attended the local church. The young man had an active life position. He was involved in sports and was a favorite of those around him. No one believed that he could be involved in such a crime. The defense's biggest problems began even later, when the prosecution showed the jury a video recording in which Tyler confesses to the crime. In the video, the boy clearly stated that he had indeed helped Christie kill her husband. However, the jury was not shown the teenager's confession in its entirety. The moment when the sister entered the room and actually forced her brother to confess was not shown. This became the main obstacle to proving his innocence. To refute the prosecution's arguments, the defense had to convince the jury that this eloquent statement was false and made under pressure. For this, it was planned to call in an expert on facial expressions and gestures. It was on him that the lawyer was betting when building his tactics. Unfortunately, the judge forbade the use of this specialist's testimony, which seriously shook confidence in victory. Then the defender changed direction and decided to focus on the inconsistencies in Tyler's words. In fact, there were several suspicious moments in his confessions. First of all, he said that after the shot from the rifle, he saw a whole fountain of blood. But, according to an independent forensic expert, there could be no fountain when a bullet hits the head. With such a wound, bleeding does not start immediately, and there are definitely no blood splatters. In fact, the deceased was shot only once with a .22 caliber rifle. It left a round entry hole. The skull remained intact, so the young man clearly made up this detail. It all looked like childhood fantasies. The teenager did not know the real picture, because he had never been in Joey's bedroom at the time of his execution. Also playing into the defense's hands was the fact that at the retrial, the judge allowed the use of video where Tyler recants his confession, although at the previous hearings this was not allowed to be shown to the jury. In his rebuttal, the convict told the police a different version of events, which clearly differed from his confessional testimony. According to him, on the morning of the day Joey was killed, he and Christie were going to take a short trip to meet the schoolboy's father. The young man was sitting in the car when he heard a suspicious noise in the house. However, he did not check what had happened. Christie came out of the house very quickly, and they went on their journey. It was on the way back that the sister confessed to killing her husband. In addition, she immediately began to ask her brother to take some of the blame for the massacre. She believed that this would allow her to avoid the death penalty. Christie did not care at all about the fate of Tyler, who had not even finished school yet. He agreed, because he really wanted to help his sister and protect her. October 31, 2008 was the last day of Tyler's retrial. The result depended on which version of the defendant's words the jury would believe. On this day, the convict was to speak in his own defense. He admitted that he took the blame because Christie convinced him that a minor would not be put in jail. At the same time, she believed that her brother's confession would allow her to avoid the death penalty and save her life. According to the young man, he and Christie agreed that he would take the blame for the crime after her signal. But what exactly this sign would be, they did not discuss. Tyler received it when, during an interrogation after the murder, Christie entered the office and sat down next to him. She took the boy by the hand, and thus gave the signal. But the brother did not take all the blame on himself, as Christie wanted, but told about their joint participation in the case. As it turned out, before giving the signal, Christie, during interrogation in the next room, first claimed that an accident had occurred in which her husband was seriously wounded and died. But under pressure from the police, she gave up, but decided to drag her brother to the bottom with her. After the final speech of the prosecution, the lawyer also delivered his closing speech. In his opinion, apart from the confessions of a 13-year-old child, the prosecution really has no evidence that would directly link Tyler to the murder. At the same time, the defender expressed doubt that the words of a child who was clearly in a stressful situation could be taken seriously. The wait for the jury's decision seemed endless. When the jury returned, 12 men and women announced that they considered 19-year-old Tyler innocent. After 5.5 years of unjust imprisonment, the young man was finally free. However, the question of justice for the family of the deceased remained open. Joey's parents just wanted to know the truth. They no longer sought revenge or punishment for someone for the murder. All that the mother and father wanted was to find out what had really happened on that tragic day. After his release from prison, Tyler Edmonds returned to a normal life. He graduated from college and received a medical degree. The young man took care of getting a higher education in his chosen specialty. After that, the young man left Mississippi and moved to Florida, where no one knows him. He lives there to this day. In later interviews, the unjustly convicted man admitted that the consequences of a false statement still haunt him. It is impossible to forget the 5.5 years of imprisonment that ruined his life. But in general, he managed to adapt to a normal life. After what he experienced, Tyler came to the conclusion that the police should record video not only for a limited period of communication with suspects when it is convenient for them. The recording should be continuous so that it is possible to view all the details. In addition, children should not communicate with the police without the presence of parents and a lawyer, so that they are not pressured. In many states, it is allowed to talk to detectives only in the presence of parents. However, this is not an effective measure to protect teenagers. The fact is that not all parents are well versed in the criminal code and their own rights. There are many incidents associated with non-compliance with these seemingly obvious rules. Therefore, the participation of a lawyer is a quite appropriate measure. After the retrial and Tyler's acquittal, the prosecutor's office became interested in the activities of the forensic expert Stephen Hain, who claimed that he determined by the trajectory of the bullet how many people were holding the rifle. This high-profile statement called into question the competence and impartiality of the specialist. After analyzing other cases where he appeared as an expert, at least 2 controversial cases were found when the decision was also made on the basis of the specialist's dubious conclusions. As a result, 2 more men were released in 2008. This happened after receiving the results of DNA analysis found on the victim's body. After carefully examining the material, it was possible to confirm that it did not match the profile of these 2 convicts. And it was possible to finally be convinced of a miscarriage of justice after the confession of the real killer. Which once again confirmed the incompetence of this expert. In the end, he was suspended from participating in trials. As for Christie, after the first trial, she was sentenced to only 12 years in prison for complicity. While she was serving her sentence, the criminal, thanks to her talent for manipulation, convinced two cellmates to help her escape. However, the plan failed. In 2008, she again found herself in the dock in the case of the murder of Joey Fulgham due to the acquittal of her brother. This time she was found guilty and sentenced to death. Christie's lawyer filed an appeal in 2010, and after the retrial, the death sentence was cancelled. The woman was sentenced to life imprisonment. After that, Christie wrote a letter of apology to her stepbrother. In fact, it was a short note that said, "I'm sorry, you know what for." Of course, this cynical letter only angered the young man, who lost almost 6 years of his life serving a sentence for a crime he did not commit, for the sake of his sister. And she did not even have the courage and the right words to write a normal letter. Tyler completely broke off relations with his stepsister. He is convinced that the only reason she became close to him in life was the desire to use the boy for her own selfish purposes in one way or another. Of course, at that time, no one could have imagined that this would lead to the imprisonment of a schoolboy. Please write your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. For those who are new here, subscribing is the best way to stay updated on future content. Also give a like please. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Thank you for your support during this difficult time. Until next time, friends.